happy to be drafted by the Black Archives to moderate this discussion. You've already met our panelists on this discussion of playing through black golfers overcoming the forbidden color barriers. But I think it's important to understand why it was so important to African Americans to finally break that color barrier, and why did they want to even be bothered with it. A lot of times people think that golf is a way to spoil a good walk, but it often is much more to the people who play the game. So why don't one of you gentlemen take that first question on why is golf important, and why did African Americans see integration as being vital?
I'll start. Good afternoon. I wondered why Jim asked me to be on this panel, because I don't play golf that well. although I enjoy doing it. And as I began to take a look at the book, Forbidden Fairways, and do some research around, it occurred to me the very things that Jim said earlier, that golf and other forms of recreation were civil rights issues. If I started saying something, you would all be able to finish it. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right. So my theory is that golf, among other things, is part of the pursuit of happiness. And our nation, throughout its history, has taken steps to deny certain people the pursuit of happiness. At one time it was illegal, it was unlawful, it was a criminal act to teach a person of color to read. Later on, there were all types of barriers that are erected to voting rights and the like. And so we see vestiges of this that still remain today. And for the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to talk about the pursuit of happiness through litigation to access the means of public largesse. That is, if I want to go play golf and I'm a tax-paying citizen, I should be able to make use of the facilities. That wasn't always the case. We'll start here in Kansas City in the late 30s. The video mentioned Tom Webster and some other people who sued Kansas City for the right to play golf any day of the week. Now, there was a practice. It wasn't a city ordinance, it wasn't state law, it was a practice that white people could play swope number 1, and that black people could play swope number 2 days a week, Monday or Tuesday. And so these gentlemen filed suit alleging that they were taxpayers, that this was a tax-supported facility, and that they should be able to play at any time. Now, bear in mind that since 1896, up until 1954, there was the Plessy decision that said separate but equal. Well, anyone who's been to swope number 1, or what we used to call swope number 2, knows that they were not equal. And the same is true with respect to the facts that were found in the Brown case in the early 50s. But bear in mind, this was way before Brown. And so they were really civil rights pioneers in the sense that they had the will, they had the courage to, in essence, fight City Hall for the right to play golf. And there are a couple of ironies that I found in the course of my research. They went to the Jackson County Circuit Court, and in 1939, one of the circuit judges, Judge Ben W. Turkey, found in favor of the plaintiffs. But the remedy that the court determined was that black people would be able to play golf every day a week at swope number 2. It still did not open up number 1. And anyone who, well, I've said that once already, if you've seen both of them, you know that they're not equal. But that was the first blow. support the issue of full access. Ironically, Judge Purdy was a member of the Jewish faith. And so how the case got to him, I'll never know. But members of the Jewish faith also faced discrimination as well. And in combining their resources, they were able to buy their own country clubs. And some still exist today, although from my experience, they're all open to whoever wants to go and play if you're invited. And so consequently, Judge Turdy, who was near the end of his career at that time, eventually retired, and he was replaced on the circuit court by the first black circuit judge, Judge Lewis W. Clymer. And so I saw a number of connected ironies throughout the research that I did. I can talk more about the efforts across the country involving golf course desegregation. But still, these were before the Brown case in 1954. Of note, later in the early 50s, there was a similar case that was brought against the city of Kansas City to desegregate the Swope Park swimming pool. And I learned in my research that at the appellate level, Justice Thurgood Marshall was part of the case on behalf of the plaintiffs. And eventually, the Swope Park swimming pool was desegregated. Now, I'll talk a little bit later about reactions to these cases, because sometimes the reaction would be, we're going to close the swimming pool. We're going to close the golf course. We're going to lease the golf course to a private entity so that it's no longer public. Or we're going to sell, or in some instances, they were even closed down. So these types of progress setback, progress backlash have been replete throughout our history in many, many different ways. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to participate on this panel.
We're going to hear from Don Kueh and some comments that he has.
I think you'll be able to hear me. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking Jim Watts, Dr. Williams, and the Black Archives of Mid-America for the invitation to participate in this forum. In 2012, I was asked to chair the Centennial Committee of the Kansas City Golf Hall of Fame. Just for background, KCGA, Kansas City Golf Association, merged with the Kansas Golf Association and Kansas Women's Golf Association in 2018 to form what is now called Central Links Golf. I've been on the board of directors of the two organizations since 2006, and I serve as chair of the Hall of Fame Committee. As part of the 100-year anniversary of the KCGA, I wrote a series of articles that we published monthly covering the history of golf in this area. These pieces became known by a lot of people as Jimmy the Caddy, after the character that I created to tell that story. While I was doing research for that project, I came across an article that stuck with me for several months. In July 2005, J. Brady McCullough wrote a story for the Kansas City Star that I just couldn't shake. And he'd not written as extensively as he did back then and interviewed the people that he did, many of whom have since passed. An important chapter of our history and the history of golf and the history of Kansas City may have been lost forever. I'll mention McCullough again a little later, but I want to tell you a story. I call it the steepest hill in local golf. Now, I'm no Henry Louis Gates Jr., but let's turn the page again. As troubling as this tale is to many of you, it won't be a surprise. But in the 40s and 50s, it was the way it was. From the time golf came to Kansas City in about 1894 until early 1950, there were 55 golf courses that opened and several that closed in this area, according to Jimmy the Caddy anyway. 19 of these were, quote, open to the public. See, there was a movement around the country back then that grew out of the Works Progress Administration and other projects of the Great Depression to build municipal and public golf courses as a way to employ hardworking citizens and to democratize the game, allowing poor and middle-class people an opportunity to enjoy the values of health, recreation, and camaraderie that we associate with playing golf. That is, as long as you wear white. But these same values were largely denied to men and women of color. 75 years ago, on an otherwise quiet Friday afternoon in March 1950, March 24th to be specific, that began to change. That was the day that 4 very brave and very dedicated black men showed up at the counter at Swope No. 1 and demanded the right to play the course that they had been barred from since it opened. The course their Texas were supporting. And you saw a little bit of a preview in the video. See, golf had been played somewhere in Swope Park since the first free golf course. Not much of a golf course as we think of it today, but the first free golf course opened near the gate in 1906. James Dalgleish, who is often referred to as the father of Kansas City golf, also designed the second public course in the park in 1911. And of course, many of you know that renowned architect A.W. Tillinghast crafted what we now call Swope Memorial in 1934. In all that time, with one exception that you'll hear about a little bit more later, no black man or woman had ever played on that so-called public golf course. There was that other course that African Americans were allowed to play. It was that beat up, hard scrabble, unkept 9 holes down the hill. Folks call it Swope No. 2. But in order to fully understand how deep the roots of the game had grown by the middle of the 1900s, I got to tell you, black golfers have been playing the game in Kansas City since the early 1920s. Here's the backstory to that, as they say. In 1879, a freed slave by the name of Junius Groves walked from Kentucky to Kansas. He was part of the Great Exodus, or the Exoduster movement. When he got here, he had virtually no money, some say as little as $1 in his pocket. But he found work as a sharecropper. Eventually, he saved some money, bought a little land under the Homestead Act, and started growing potatoes. By the early 1900s, he was so successful, he became known as the Potato King of the world. And a small town grew up around his operation between Edwardsville and Bonner Springs. It was called Grove Center. So I guess you're saying to yourself, Don, what do potatoes have to do with playing golf? Well, I'm going to tell you. Groves built a small golf course on some of his property just for the use of his black employees. I guess watching potatoes grow was the equivalent of watching paint dry. So they needed something to keep these folks engaged and involved. There may not have been another golf course like it anywhere in America, built by and for black people. So from the dirt and dust of the potato farm near Edwardsville came a group of black players who eventually morphed into the Heart of America Golf Club. Heart of America became the organization for minority golfers in this area. In 1937, as you heard the judge say, they sued the Parks Board for the right of its members to play the course that they were in fact paying for through their taxes. Times were changing, but slowly. A few years later, the U.S. entered World War II. Thousands of black men enlisted in the armed services. Thousands of black women worked in war industries, building the ships, the weaponry, and the landing craft that won the war. This might be the story of your family. Eventually, veterans came home and tried to rebuild their lives, but on the streets of Kansas City, like the rest of the country, it wasn't so easy. After the war, in 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order Number 9981, which abolished racial discrimination in the armed forces. Although effectuating the president's order would take years, it proved to be the first bullet fired at Jim Crow in the military. So, back to our story. Think about 1950. Jackie Robinson and Branch Rickey had broken the color barrier in the major leagues in 1947. It was still 13 years before Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, Brown versus Board of Education wasn't on the radar yet, because Rosa Parks wouldn't take her stand on the Montgomery bus for another 5 years. But golf, golf was becoming one of the first battlegrounds in the fight for civil rights. African Americans fought for freedom in Europe and Asia, but found little of it when they came home. The right to vote, to have access to good schools, to eat in restaurants, stores, stop and shop in stores of their own choosing were denied. But most of you know that story way better than I do. In golf, as I said in that video clip, Swope #1 was like a virtual country club for middle-class whites. The A.W. Tillinghast design was about as close to the non-white public as Kansas City Country Club or Milburn were. Black golfers did have access to those 9 holes down the hill, Swope #2, but only on Mondays and Tuesdays. Well, on March 24th, 1950, the president of the Heart of America Golf Club, Mr. George Johnson, who started playing on that potato farm back in the 20s, and 3 of his buddies, Mr. Reuben Benton, a newspaper man who would become co-owner of the Call newspaper, Mr. Sylvester Pat Johnson, and Mr. Leroy Doty, who were also part of the Heart of America Golf Club, climbed the steepest hill in local golf. They drove up to Swope #1 and forced the issue. They called themselves the Foursome. According to that article by J. Brady McCullough in the Star in 2005, and an article in the Call from April 7th of 1950, quote, they drove that winding road up the hill, walked into the clubhouse, and laid their greens fees on the counter. The man behind the counter looked up, astonished, and they knew what he was saying. You can't play here, but you can play at course #2. They expect them to turn around and walk away and get back in their cars like the black men who preceded them, but not on this day. Not with the seeds of change that have been planted on golf courses across the country. The Call reported the conversation went something I expected before publication. This was somewhat sanitized. So use your imagination. Now, boys, you know you can't play here. You're colored fellas. Who says we can't? Well, they said it downtown. Who said it and why? Can't say who said it, but they said it, and that's all I know. Well, if you can't say who said it, and you don't know why we can't play, why don't we just go ahead and play and let them tell us? So they went to the first tee. There were 3 white players who were about ready to hit their tee shots, and in a show of unexpected golf etiquette, one of them said, we're kind of duffers. We'd like for you fellas to go ahead and hit first, and we won't hold you up. The superintendent, a beaten man, walked back to the clubhouse. Meanwhile, anticipating the sounds of sirens and police that never came, the 4 men enjoyed what would be the first of many rounds on the hallowed grounds of Swope #1. But the white men who frequented the course weren't about to give up their turf that easy. Incidents of broken windows and slashed tires were numerous. Some would show up in groups of 5 and roll dice, see which 4 would play the front 9, and then the high score of those 4 would stand guard while the others played the back 9. Other groups would meet at a shopping area near 47th Street and take a taxi to the golf course. Eventually, the city stopped maintaining the Tillinghast course as fewer and fewer white players showed up, and that period of decline lasted almost 25 years. It wasn't until Mr. Ollie Gates, an old friend of Reuben Benton's and head of the Parks Board, name you probably know, pushed for the city to back the renovation of Swope #1 to its pre-1950s splendor, that it became everybody's golf course again. 55 years after the foursome, in 2005, the USGA conducted, the United States Golf Association, conducted the Women's Amateur Public Links Championship at Swope Memorial, and is now known. Players from all over the globe competed, just as the foursome might have imagined. The doors of the course were open to all. They called themselves the foursome, and they beat Jim Crow 1-up in a classic battle that went on for years. It was for their courage to define the Jim Crow conventions of the times, for the example they set for generations who followed them to the well-maintained fairways of municipal golf courses all over America, for the love they demonstrated for the game of golf against great obstacles. That the board of directors of the Kansas City Golf Association included the fourth, Mr. George Johnson, Mr. Reuben Benton, Mr. Sylvester Pat Johnson, and Mr. Leroy Doty in the 2014 class of the Kansas City Golf Hall of Fame.
Yes, sir. I was just getting ready to call them. You want the microphone?
I don't need a mic. I'll stand up though. I'm Bob Drake. And I'm a North Carolinian. I grew up in North Carolina in a little town called Fayetteville. This college that you see is located there. So I attended school there. But I'm going to tell you a story about when I was in high school in Fayetteville, North Carolina. My mother used to say, and I heard this, the nerve of you coming in here, boy, you've been out there playing all day, my siblings and I. The nerve of you coming in the house, your shoes are dirty. You know, you got some gall, you got some nerve. And so, when I went to high school, I walked by.
This is brought to you by Kansas City Business Association, working to improve our community.